So good morning. So I thought I would follow up my previous video about neutral density filters. And for this video, I'm going to talk about how I set up for long exposure waterscapes. So I'm going to talk about preparing to use the neutral density filters, getting the camera ready to go. I'm going to talk about exposure, getting the correct exposure along with the shutter speed that you're wanting to get for your particular waterscape scene. And then I'm also going to talk about a couple of issues that come along with using neutral density filters. So I came out here this morning to get some long exposure waterscapes, and with this type of setting I don't need a super long exposure, maybe about 1 second or so. So to set up for that, first I get the tripod in the water. Next I take my filter holder and I attach it to the camera. So I'm not putting the filter in the filter holder, I'm just getting it ready for the filter. So I get that on the tripod and I compose an image. So once I have a scene that I'm looking to capture, that's when I can now set up for my exposure. Okay, so for the exposure, a few things. First of all, I use manual mode. So I am in control of aperture, ISO, as well as shutter speed. And then I always use my live view, especially since I'm sitting in the canoe and I can't really get up to the viewfinder. I have to rely on the LCD panel, but more importantly, I like to look at that histogram to help me set up my exposure. And then last, I use, and this is just a personal preference, I use evaluative or multi-segment metering mode, meaning when I am adjusting my exposure, the camera is evaluating the entire scene, not just a spot. Now, I like to set up my exposure before I put a filter in the filter holder. So I like to use my shutter speed as the reference point. So once I have that set up, then I know how many stops of light I need to apply with the neutral density filter in order to achieve the shutter speed that I'm looking for. Now, aperture and ISO. I like to set my aperture, I like to use a range in a setting like this where I don't have a prominent foreground and background as well. I can use an aperture of f8 to f11 quite easily. It gives me that depth of field, and it's also, the sharpest range for my camera and lens setup. So f8 to f11, and maybe I'll push it to f16. I will, when I know I'm going to be putting a filter on, I will set my aperture to f8, which is the widest aperture that I use. Now with the ISO, I set the ISO to 100, the lowest ISO I can set it at. So why do I set my aperture at f8 and why do I set my ISO at 100? Well, once I know that I'm going to be applying a filter, maybe a 3-stop filter, the light changes and, the clouds come in. So I may have to tweak the exposure. And if I don't have another filter I want to add, then I'm going to have to rely on one of those 3 exposure settings to get back the correct exposure. So since I really don't want to be messing with my shutter speed much, I prefer to tweak the exposure using my aperture as well as my ISO. So with the aperture at its widest, I know that I can adjust it. So I can reduce the light. If I go from f8 to f11, I'm actually reducing the light by 1 stop. So that gives me some leverage in terms of, reducing the light. ISO is the opposite. Because I have it at its lowest setting, I can add light back with the ISO. So I can go from 100 to 200 and add back a stop of light. That's without changing the shutter speed, and that's without changing out the neutral density filter. So what if you like to use shutter speed priority? Or aperture priority. Now, shutter speed priority makes sense here because really shutter speed is your priority for these long exposures. So let's see what might happen using that type of setting. So I went ahead and switched over to shutter speed mode. Now remember, when you're in shutter speed mode or aperture mode, the camera is going to decide on the settings, on the exposure. It's always going to try to expose down the middle. Remember that. You have to tell it to expose under or above. That's exposure compensation. I have a video all about that. Let's say now that you decide that you want a 1 second exposure. Now the sun is pretty high now, and it doesn't take a lot of exposure time to make that scene bright. If I set my shutter speed to 1 second, because that's my priority, I have control over that, what do you think the aperture and the ISO are going to look like? Okay, so you can see the shutter speed is 1 second and ISO is 100, and look at the aperture flashing, f22. What does all this mean? All right, well, obviously I am way overexposing the scene with that 1 second exposure time. And the camera is trying to compensate for that. So it set the ISO to its lowest and is trying to get the aperture to its narrowest. In my camera, it's f22. So it's as narrow as it can go. Why is it flashing? Because it can't get the correct exposure with this 1 second exposure. Now obviously that's without the filter attached. So what's going to happen when I apply the filter? So again, we've got a 1 second exposure set up. If I put a 3-stop filter in front of that camera, in front of that lens, what's going to happen? Well, the ISO is probably not going to change. What's going to happen is the aperture is going to change, all right, because that is so severely affected. I expect that is going to open up a bit. So let's put a 3-stop filter on there and see what happens. Okay, so when I put that filter in there, look what happened. So you can see the ISO is still 100. I have my shutter speed still at 1 second. Look at the f22. I mean, you can see the exposure has changed. You can see that with the histogram and the LCD panel. But the f22, the aperture is still flashing. So I have to adjust that. So I take my shutter speed, and that's the only thing I have control over, and I speed it up to half a second. So I had to drop it down a stop before I could get it to the correct exposure that the camera is wanting. So what I did is I took the 3-stop filter out and I replaced it with the 6-stop. Now let's take a look at the settings. So I'm back at 1 second shutter speed exposure, and look at what happened to my aperture. Now that looks much better to me. I'm happy with f11, ISO is 100, so good to go with that. Now, there are 2 issues that come up with using neutral density filters. One is vignetting and the other is light leak. So let's talk about vignetting. Vignetting simply means light fall off. In other words, light coming in to the lens is interrupted, and you end up seeing dark edges around your image. Now, optically, what affects that are wide apertures, very short focal lengths, and wide angle lenses. And so if I put my super wide angle lens on there, I'm more likely going to see those dark corners around the edges. I usually don't see that without the filters and filter holder, however. So that comes to the mechanical effects of using filters on vignetting. So when you put something in front of the lens, the filter holder and the filters, you're going to get that light fall off. You will see vignetting, and the more filters you use, the more likely you're going to see that. The wider the angle, the shorter the focal length of your lens, the more likely you're going to see it. So what I did is to make this point, I went ahead and attached my circular polarizer. And remember, the circular polarizer reduces light by 1 to 2 stops as well. So you can use it, you can combine it with your neutral density filters. So I attached that there, and then to the polarizer I attached the filter holder with 2 filters inside. So when I took my picture, you can see that there's some vignetting going on. Now, if I were to zoom in and use a shorter focal length, it would get rid of those dark areas. So when you see those dark areas, don't panic. Sometimes you can manage those in editing. So with a little editing, you can get rid of those dark areas. The other issue is light leak, and that's really what's going on between the filters. When you're using more than one filter, there's a space in between, and there might be some light leaking in there. That's really, also going to depend on the angle of the sun and where most of the light is coming from. So the higher the sun is in the sky, the more likely you're going to see that effect. Now, do you really see that effect? Honestly, I'm not sure. I mentioned it in my previous video. I have 2 filters in there. I could take those 2 filters out and replace it with a 10 stop. Right now there's a 6 and a 3. I could take those out and just put 1 filter in there, and that might help the image a little bit. But honestly, I'm not sure if I would even see a difference. Okay, so in summary, you're going to do long exposure waterscapes. You're going to need, obviously, a tripod. Highly recommend you have at least 2 neutral density filters on hand. So you're going to go out there and you're going to assess the water and decide what shutter speed you want to use for your long exposure. You're going to set up your camera and you want to compose and you want to expose. Now, with the exposure, again, if you use shutter speed priority, the camera is going to do that for you. But you need to be ready to make adjustments because your camera is going to be looking for a standard exposure, and you might end up with an aperture or ISO that you're not happy with. So go back to that manual mode for a second, because that's what I am so used to using. I highly recommend it. You're in control of all 3 settings. I like to set my exposure before I put that filter in and use that shutter speed as my reference point. And if you can't calculate in your head shutter speed, stops of light, right? Get an exposure chart. Usually they come with the filter that you purchase. Get an exposure chart, look at the shutter speed that you set it at before you put the filter in, and then draw down to the shutter speed you want to have, and then look at the f-stop reduction that you're going to apply. And more importantly, just go out there and create some images, experiment, and have a good time.